Welcome to our third panel of the day, of our first day of the International Symposium through the International Programs Office here at CSU. My name is Sarah Olson. I work for the Office of International Programs, and I am very pleased to welcome you to this amazing panel today on the confluence of diversity, equity, inclusion, and international education. Our moderator today for this panel is Craig Chesson, Associate Dean of Students here at Colorado State University, who is joined by our two panelists, Malaika Serrano, Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for International Studies Abroad, and Eric Aoki, who's Professor in Communication Studies here at Colorado State University. I want to remind everyone that we do have a Q&A box here, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat box there throughout the session, and we look forward to getting to those. And thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Craig.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited to be here for our panelists. What an exciting topic. And we're just going to go ahead and get right into it. And for our panelists here today, kind of the first question to get us going, what do you think about the confluence in our efforts to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion and internationalization? Kind of share with our audience today your own experiences that brings you to this conversation. What are your personal experiences in growing your international competence? Yeah, we'll go ahead. Malaika, you start us out.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you so much, Colorado State University. And of course, my wonderful friend, Eric. I'm really excited to be here. So friends, my name is Malaika Serrano. My pronouns are she, her, hers. As Sarah kindly mentioned, I am the VP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at International Studies Abroad. What brings me to this space, to this work, really is centering around my own social identities. So I self-identify as being African-American or Black, currently able-bodied, heterosexual, cisgendered woman. My roots are from the South, Southeastern United States, but I also have very, very strong ties to Latin America. And my nearly 20-year journey in international education began, as so many other journeys do, with my own study abroad experience. So studying abroad as an undergraduate in Australia, and then as a graduate student in Brazil, led to teaching abroad for a year in Venezuela, and then a variety of different admin as well as teaching roles in the international education space. So I think that I will go ahead and stop there and turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Eric.
Thanks, Malaika. I come to the panel today. I always sort of give my parents props, and I'm from the Central San Joaquin Valley of Fresno, California. And I grew up in a rural area with a lot of intercultural diversity going on within that area, also within the state of California broadly as well too. And so my socialization was kind of just right into it from the get-go. I have intersectional identities that bring together sexual orientation in terms of being a gay, out gay professor on campus. I also have ethnic and racial backgrounds in terms of being both from Mexican American and Japanese American heritage. And you name it, I've got inter-religious dynamics going on with my parents and socialization, my own autonomous way of expressing spirituality in the world. I use the pronouns he, him, and his. And I come at this from having actually been a later in life traveler internationally. Did a lot of regional travel within the United States, and I think that offers a lot of intercultural experience as well. And then came to global international travel a bit later, with the exception of the neighbors here in the US, Canada and Mexico. I was able to sort of visit there and engage interculturally there. I too will leave it there for now, and we can come back to more integration of all that good stuff as we continue to talk.
Thank you to the both of you. And I'd like to add, particularly for myself, once again, Craig Chesson, he, him, his, identify as an African-American male. One of the things growing up in New York City, it was almost an embarrassment of riches in the environment that I was raised in, having strong ethnic communities, first generation Italian, first generation Polish, German, from Puerto Rico, Cuban immigrants was just in your face daily. But with that, though, I did not have as far as physically traveling growing up, and not until, similar to Eric, later on in my professional career, where I had the opportunity to go abroad, which we'll integrate later on. But that sets our context, and I'll share for our next question here. All of these experiences are just fascinating and occurred at different times in our lives that contributed to our international experience. How do you respond to the belief that you need to have lots of resources to have international experiences, or it's required to leave the country for intercultural competence? And is it different for individuals from marginalized backgrounds? And this time, Eric, if you could start us off.
Sure, Craig. Yeah, in terms of looking at the resources, I use that word pretty broadly. And so I know a lot of times people think about economics as part of that, but I think about communicative and communication foundational resources as well too. And so being able to have established and built a wide array of engagements in our life, intercultural engagements, if you will, some of those engagements that involve really learning how to build that competency set. I always talk about becoming more effective and appropriate in cultural contexts that we weren't initially socialized into or born into typically, and building those interpersonal and intercultural competency sets over the course of time. I think that resources can be about building that foundation for being able to hold a conversation. The resources of being able to know how to cultural shift and code shift and linguistic shift in different pockets and regions based on more effective means to be able to accommodate and communicate with folks from different backgrounds and from different perspectives as well too. That takes a lot of engagement, a lot of intercultural, interpersonal interactions and conversations, and I think that's one of the resources that I really hold on to in terms of a mentor who had instilled in me back at the University of Washington that conversations are the most meaningful and significant moments of our lives. And it took a while to really sort of take that in and how profound that is. But being able to be in conversation, both verbally, non-verbally, you name it, in conversation with someone else across the beauties of the difference and the complexities of the difference as well too. So let me stop there and invite Malika into the conversation, and we can keep growing it as we need to here.
I love it. So I've muted myself, to hold for background noise, but now I'm muting myself to hold for my amens and my show nuffs that are just, they're just flowing, Eric, listening to you speak. And I want to amplify and build on, that richness that you just shared, lifted up with us, looking at resources, looking at cultural capital wealth. And so, Craig, the way I'd like to address this question is really kind of flipping things on its head and challenging us to look at the current discourse in education abroad. When we look at historically marginalized or minoritized communities, traditionally it has centered around deficits and not take into account the cultural capital wealth that all of these communities are bringing, into the conversation, as Eric has kind of lifted up, and both of you in your respective stories from your rich cultural backgrounds. I think that when we do critically look at how our field has historically approached this resource question, we can look at how are we marketing our programs, how are we implementing them on our own campuses and organizations? And again, reframing this conversation from being from a deficit into more of an asset-based conversation. This helps, I believe, remove some of the barriers to education abroad, because it causes us to pause and frankly kind of look in the mirror and say, what could we be doing differently? How can we reimagine, how these programs are created and facilitated?
This time, I just want to give another plug and reminder with the Q&A from the audience. Please submit, because we do want to engage you in this dialogue and this conversation. Our next prompt, next question, really like this is I get this a lot from students and a lot of community members too. How do we become more effective and appropriate with cultures that we're not born into? What's the motivation, the attitude, knowledge, and skills necessary to engage in global awareness? And I'll let one of you go ahead and take that question.
I'll jump back in here and talk about like the complexities of things like motivation and attitude, knowledge and skill sets. I think some of those resources that Malika and I are getting at are the things that you can continue to build and evolve over time. My students who are on call, high intercultural communication class, they know that I oftentimes talk about whatever metaphor works for you, whether it's a toolbox or a knapsack, but putting in there a lot of different kind of resources and communication skills that you build over the course of time. We know too that just being in a diverse field, if you will, a landscape of diversity doesn't guarantee easiness either, right? It doesn't guarantee that people immediately feel motivated, to go back to that point, to want to engage and learn and build that knapsack with these communication-based skills. And so at the heart of it, it really is important to get individuals to start really thinking about what is the drive and the reason and that motivation for why building an intercultural communication competency knapsack or toolbox is valuable in your life. For some of my students, that has meant I'm taking a new job. So they go from that sort of perspective of I'm walking into a new career, a new job where it's the most diverse context that I've ever been engaged in my life, in terms of like the visible and the invisible diversities that are present in the system of people who will become my coworkers and likely friends over the course of time. And so when I think about it like that, trying to get a sensibility for what our motivation, what it is that is there, that might in fact be that engine to help us to go out and seek more knowledge, more developing our attitude around diversity, and not seeing it, as Malika was saying earlier, as just a deficit, right? The difference of deficit, that can problematize a lot of the communicative moving forwardness, if you will, that we're looking toward here. So with that, motivation is something that I really wanted to push on in terms of like getting some self-awareness, if you will, about what your motivational drive is. How do you begin to build that sense of attitude, knowledge, and the skills that are necessary there over time?
Nice. Thanks. That's such a great framework. I'm jotting down notes as well and enjoying this. Craig, I suppose like for me, when I think about this great question, I like to center myself in the conversation around inclusive pedagogy. I think that also speaks to, what Eric is lifting up here in terms of kind of like the motivation, as well as acknowledging the apparent and non-apparent identities that we are all carrying with us and how those may shift and present differently over time and, different contexts. And so, when you think about this, looking at the social identities of all the stakeholders, so our students, administrators, faculty and families, and, how they can influence the education abroad programs, in terms of their design, how they're marketed and administered, and kind of concurrent to this, and maybe circling back around to the communication piece that Eric had lifted up earlier, just thinking about the narratives and how we all have agency to disrupt narratives around historically minoritized communities that may be harmful or that may be inaccurate. So kind of dispelling that myth of the single story and using our platforms to be able to amplify more like fuller, richer pieces.
If I could add, and I really enjoyed listening to both of you, and particularly Eric's point, particularly with the knowledge, one of the things that I found in my experience too is just keeping things simple and not trying to jump in with big context or trying to engage on a large scale. And the other piece too is if you're not familiar with a culture and it's different, it doesn't mean coming with a frame for personal awareness that it's less than, just because you don't have that ground and you don't have that that foundation. And the other piece is, as far as there is a little bit of risk taking and keeping it simple, the more you engage and take that first step, the more you're going to grow, the more you're going to be accepted and is more appreciated from the different culture when you do take that initiative. So keep it simple. More self-awareness, I think, is big. And I can't say it more than enough, the act of listening. You got to listen. That's the big piece too. I would want to summarize there. All right. Well, I want to go to another question here. How are you finding ways to educate and empower students to tackle the challenging issues and work with each other across racial, ethnic, and cultural lines? And what about faculty and staff?
Well, I think one of the skills I've learned over the course of time is, and it sounds like an easy way out of this question, but it's not, is in addition to building those skill sets, in addition to building that sense of knowledge, and I want to build there and say that knowledge can come from a lot of different places, right? Experiences, books, travel experiences themselves, engagements with individuals, and actually, as you said, Craig, actually listening when you ask questions too, but listening to how people give perspective on different issues and different concerns that we might be talking through and so forth. But yeah, so when you start to sort of think about all those different kinds of things in terms of trying to figure out how this package comes together, how knowledge sets come together, and where we might go with that, I really started to I wanted to come back to that sort of question about patience and how do we be patient while still being evolving and acting, right? One of the things that I talk to students a lot about is what happens when we stepped outside of our comfortability zones and what can we learn from that? Another way of asking that or framing that same kind of comfortability zone, because comfort is nice. It's safe, it's secure, it's predictable. It's all these things that allow us to be the most preferred us, if you will, oftentimes in a particular cultural context. But that doesn't mean that it continues to get us building new knowledge and new skill sets by being comfortable in that element there. And so in looking at things, the other construct that I'll leave here is, I'll put on the table here is this notion of what happens when we know we live in a global society even where decisions have to be made, but what happens when we start, for example, seeing things on spectrums and seeing things, phenomenon, if you will, outside of binaries, you know, whether it's gender binaries, whether it's intellectual binaries, whether it's binaries that get us to think that your only choices are this or that, like really looking at that spectrum in between and looking for that intersectional or multicultural and or identity that doesn't quite fit in the this or the that. There's so much learning that can be happening there that sometimes because we are moving so quickly, trying to make such quick decisions, we forget to know that knowledge can be built on that spectrum rather than just on the polar ends of the this or the that or the either or the or. Like, I don't know if you want to chime in there as well.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So, in terms of, first sort of centering around the students, I believe that modeling vulnerability, so, be it ourselves first and foremost, is one of the most powerful ways in which we can kind of break down folks' feelings of, be it, imposter syndrome or, other sort of like self-doubt kind of pieces. And by showing up and saying, hey, here's an experience. This is the time where I actually kind of got something, wrong, or I was a little bit off on that. And, I learned from this experience, I think really goes a long way. So sharing and lifting up our own personal stories and our own journeys, I think is really beautiful and powerful. And, hopefully kind of the way that we started this conversation is sort of modeling that. I I know the questions around students, but I do think it's important, especially for those of us who are in this room right now, who may identify as being members of staff or administrators or faculty, that we also have a responsibility. So, again, echoing my colleagues here, the work, it really begins with ourselves. And had the chance to do some identity work with Craig, as well as looking at, examining privilege. So having those kinds of conversations, I think is really beneficial and can help in terms of looking at, strengthening coalitions, if you will.
Yeah, if I could quickly add there, Malika, too, you got me thinking about making our lives the have to, if you will, towards this progress, that it's not enough to sort of think that I engage in diversity or engage in international consciousness on particular days of celebration of particular markers. Those are all meaningful and all powerful, but pushing beyond that and seeing that engagement and that inquiry, and that even if it's engagement of ideas for the day, right, is a have to on a daily basis if you're committed to doing this kind of work, that it can't just be something that you conveniently just want to tap into, at times that are best for you, but that it is a community and global based engagement of these kinds of things on a day-to-day basis, rather than a program coming to a program one time, right? Those kinds of things. These are all meaningful. I don't want to discount that. And yet at the same time, at the micro level, if you will, rather than the meso of institutional organizational knowledge building, at that micro level, how do we begin to put ourselves into engagements with other folks, intercultural interactions with other folks, so that we're practicing the skill. Those skills don't build themselves. They have to be, as you said, a little bit of trial and error at times, a little apology when things don't go exactly right, but making yourself vulnerable to the system of learning so that you can continue to build those skills, whoever we are, students, faculty, staff. I've been doing this kind of work for decades, and I still catch myself defaulting to some things that I was socialized into that are not necessarily the best practices, right? And yet I tell my students, thank goodness I can catch myself sooner, right? And if not, other people catch it as well too. But there's something about that's meaningful, is putting yourself out there to actually do the interaction and engagement and building those relationships with people.
Hello. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
Here come the amen corner.
I know.
Yes, exactly. And that's why, Mama would say, that's why you got to be friends with everybody. You know what I'm saying?
So we're going to engage the audience because the questions are coming in. They are rolling in. Our first one, what's something you wish people understood better about conceptualizing and interacting with people who have different race, gender, education, wealth, health, sexuality, nationality, or other experiences and identities?
Well, I think one thing is that, even though they can feel, as Malika was saying, pockets of vulnerability in doing so, particularly if you haven't had a lot of practice or a lot of ability to engage across those differences, but immediately seeing those differences as opportunities for growth, rather than the deficit or the negative of saying that they have to be immediately problematized. That doesn't mean that the work is simple. I don't ever want to communicate that. But it does mean that we don't get to just kind of go forward once and say, well, I tried. And my response to that is typically, yeah. And if you're born into a minoritized identity within a system, or multiple intersectional minoritized identities within a system, you got to bet that you're trying more than one time in order to be effective with different audiences there. It's not a one sort of, it's not just the privilege of being able to say, I gave it that one attempt and it went wrong, and hence I'm not going to try again. It is a growth and skill experience that takes time to build trusting and valuable relationships. You just don't get those in sort of like one engagement or one interaction, or overnight, as we oftentimes say.
Exactly. So you mean there's no like little, magical whatever, or the magical handout. Craig, you ain't got the magical handout you can just give somebody. I appreciate that question from our colleague who's in the room today. And I just lifted up three things. One, echoing Brother Eric over here, you know, leaning into differences, leaning into that. Two, leading with positive intent. I always believe in that, you know, unless you show me otherwise, I'm gonna lead with positive intent. And then three, we cannot emphasize this enough. The work begins with the self, begins with yourself. And there's no shortcut, no shortchanging that. You've got to know who you are.
And if I can add just one more thing there, Craig, too. Yeah, that's such a great list to sort of think through, but also that we can be active allies and active builders of channels for communication to become open. And let me use, I saw a question pop up about LGBTQ experiences as well, too. As I travel the globe, I am absolutely looking for a channel of communication from different folks, even here in my own home country, looking for people to build a channel of openness that communicates to me that when I pronounce who I am, it's going to be invitational and not something that I'm going to put as part of my holistic and an identity that I love being, in addition to all my other intersectional elements and of pieces of identity. And yet that's a cooperative endeavor, and it's a lot of help when I know, for example, that I am here face to face in this moment, and that doesn't get built in the moment necessarily, but that there are some channels to over time in the relationship feel a sense of safety in being able to pronounce and avow who I am without a negative implication or recourse. Those are things that have to be cooperative. They just can't be me wanting to avow and be and announce and bring that into that intersectional dynamic. There has to be some bridge building from the other end of the construction as well, conversational construction too. So at the end of the day, I'm looking for those kinds of invitations and identity safety zones as well too.
So there's another question from the audience here. What do you believe causes the most conflict between different cultures?
Well, I'll there's so many responses to this question. It's a great question. But pushing beyond, for example, the evening news, if that'll probably give me a generational spin to the phrase I just used, right? The evening news, because I'm used to looking at the evening news. But looking beyond the evening news and the ways in which identities around the globe, for example, even identities within the United States get constructed and represented. And being clear that those are representations and constructions and not necessarily one-on-one negotiations and or interactions that you've had with a person who might also self-identify or avow in that particular way. Like being critical consumers of those representations. And I use that because my students know that I'm a big fan of bell hooks with the notion of like popular culture is where the cultural pedagogy is these days. Kind of that a lot of people are turning to popular culture to learn about difference, and whether that be global, international difference, whether they turn to it or not as a learning mechanism, it starts to teach. And from that, we've got to be critical consumers of what it is that we are consuming when we do that, and not essentialize or say, this is what I saw on TV. I think people know that better than to do that, but it's hard to get that out of your cognitive set once it's been placed in there and so forth. So those kinds of things I think are really active things to be doing.
And I'll just add one piece here. I think amplifying, Eric, it is, well, Chimamanda Adichie, she teaches us about the danger of a single story, just one narrative, just one slice, one window. So the three of us actually have something in common in that we all are part of the Semester at Sea family. And this was a teaching tool that we utilized with a number of different voyages. And so I believe taking the time to engage in active listening and leading with positive intent, and not dismissing one person or one culture just based on what you may have seen in popular media, but really taking a moment to look at the full story and the beauty and complexity of everyone, is where we can, hopefully begin to break down some of those quote conflicts between cultures, I think, as our listener asked.
And at the same time, quickly recognizing that media can be a wonderful tool to learn from too. It can help start that conversation that some people are hesitant to want to start.
Thanks. Here's another one from the audience. In a university like Colorado State that emphasizes diversity in social groups, how can you actually facilitate students to engage co-culturally or across different identities? What are action steps students can take to connect with people outside of their inner circles?
That's a classic question, isn't it, you two, in terms of like moving the challenge and the vulnerability of moving beyond our comfort zones is at that base of that question to some degree. The interest and desire to want to learn or want to engage and participate in those kinds of friendships and or relationship buildings is at the heart of the question, I believe, too. And so when I think about this I really do think about that, going back to that notion that I had learned from a film I had watched many, many years ago about making your life a have to. But even if it means, for example, finding facilitators and or finding common individuals to help promote and facilitate those processes of engagement, that's a start, right? That's a beginning place to go to. And yet at the same time, I do have a very strong belief that you have to figure out a way as to what can motivate you without it being disingenuous. What can motivate you to understand and to proactively engage in communication with others across these co-cultural group lines for reasons of building a larger sense of community, a better, strong sense of, I know like some of my folks on Semester at Sea talked often about building that sort of identity of what is a global citizen and what does that mean in terms of consciousness and or practice, but putting some meaning behind those terms and those ways of interacting with folks that is coming at least from the start and foundation from the heart zone, from a mindful zone, and from a humanistic zone of trying to build that sense and that fabric of society, knowing that it's not always going to be an easy path, nor is it going to be guaranteed that there won't be moments of conflict. A lot of us communication scholars are, some who might be listening in, of course, always talk about like, it's too simple to talk about conflict as either bad or good, or I like it or I don't like it. Conflict is inevitable. And when we can learn skills over the course of time about how to better manage and mitigate and work through that conflict with each other, if we see that conflict as an opportunity for growth. That's a hard thing if you've been socialized to believe that a conflict causes disruption and harmony, right? From your world perspective. So again, thinking that through and trying to figure out where the learning and the engagement and interaction can happen, I think is a lot of good opportunity.
I'm going to switch gears here and incorporate some more social justice. My next questions are going to go to our panelists. Why do you think it's important to situate the cries of racial justice in a global frame? And how would this look to prepare students to see racial and social justice from a global perspective as we provide meaningful opportunities for global learning for students? And the second part, could this change curriculum in our experiences for students?
I couldn't respond to that at this level here. It took me a while to figure this out, but when I did, it became a really strong anchor or foundation from which I've tried to grow. And that is, for so many years, particularly when I was younger, I grappled with trying to figure out how to find a better sense of agency, a better sense of representation and identity and voice in the very system that I live in here in the United States. And I was really strongly trying to figure that out because thankfully in my life, I had wonderful individuals who were supportive of trying to help me grow in that particular way. When there were things, for example, within system that affected the identity, for example, of how do you come back when when you're born in the 1960s, how do you figure out your way out of the closet when the system initially tells you to stay in that closet? How do you learn to be proud of your identity ethnically or racially when you don't see that represented in the books that you're reading and are exposed to in terms of knowledge? How do you understand that you might even have a sense of privilege through identifying as a man or a boy or a man in a particular society, if in fact it just feels like that's the way it is, right? In terms of those kind of coding that get done there and so forth. So it took me a while to find out that sometimes you have to step outside of your system to get insights into your system. And so that's where, of course, there's that element of global travel and or intercultural regional shifting or difference in the United States, where you step outside of your comfort zone, you step outside of the system in which you predominantly operate or be, and you take a trip somewhere else. And this is not me just making this up, but learning this through good leaders, MLK Jr., going abroad and learning different systems of how to adapt to conflict management and how to talk about finding one's voice in a system, right? Those kinds of things. Sometimes that moment of stepping outside of the system and what we're comfortable with is opportunity for growth and perspective that you can then bring back into your neighborhood. You can then bring back into your locality, community, and or your own country that you're trying to find more voice, identity, and representation within. Those are, I think, the things that are sometimes hard to pull together when you're being called to the moment, right? Of trying to exist in your own, quote, neighborhood.
I would just just briefly chime in. You're asking the question, why is it important to be looking at this? I think, well, first and foremost, it'd be tone deaf, given the current context that we're in, not to do so. So I'm just gonna go ahead and name that one. And then secondly, looking at disrupting the status quo, and in whose best interest is it to maintain the status quo? So looking critically at this piece, looking at power, looking at privilege, I believe, will help give fuel and fire to situating, this conversation, again, within the current context. We cannot roll backwards. It is forward, sorry, adelante. We're moving forward.
The second part here, and this is a powerful question coming up here. Please share how the impact of social justice issues can start local, national, and promote global awareness. Specifically, we want to engage and talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and how do we understand and make sense of everything that took place and is still taking place.
When you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's important to remember and situate ourselves in the context in which it began. And so, back in 2012, there was a young man in Florida who was visiting his father, stopped by the neighborhood grocery store, got a bag of Skittles and a bottle of juice. But Brother Trayvon never made it home alive. And Black Lives Matter began a year later as a direct response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murder. And so it's important for us to remember how this began, and it's important for us to remember and lift up the names of those who've been taken from us far too soon, including Brother Ahmaud Arbery. And today is a very special day for us to all be remember and mindful of. I think that, in looking at Black Lives Matter, what I appreciate about the movement as well is that it isn't just centered around one kind of group of narratives with Black folk, the pain, etc., which is definitely part of our history, but it also centers around Black joy and innovation and creativity. So again, something I think a theme of our conversation today is looking at, folk in their entirety, looking at the different intersections that are, coming forth at the table, and, celebrating all of this. So I'm going to pause and turn it over to Brother Eric.
Thanks, Malika. I was also thinking, thank you for all of that. And I was thinking about also like what Craig was kind of getting at there too, was this like a ripple of moving from sort of the local to the national to sort of that international scale as well too. And really fascinating to watch that other folks in other countries, other individuals in other countries, that this began to resonate at really deep levels. It began to sort of, in particular last summer, all the names you mentioned, of course, but George Floyd as well, and in terms of resonating across the international global scale, brought up, I think, a moment where a lot of countries and systems, if you will, had to take a really strong self-reflective look in and acknowledge that their demographic diversity and deficits and or problems that were going on within the system, that this resonated at some really deep levels because there are similarities going on in terms of racism and colonialism in different pockets of the world. And so having a really deep look at that in deep ways, how strong it sort of grew across London and Paris and Berlin, some of those expected big cities, but also in smaller rural areas as well. Like that tells me that it had this resonance that people were hearing, that there's something here with justice and injustice that needs to be talked about, made more transparent and addressed. And that it's one thing to simply look at giving in the discourse at that macro level, giving it a discourse that we're trying to work on things, but actually seeing that practice go into place with policies, with organizational support, and with what some of the students were asking earlier, trying to actually build relationships at that micro level from people to people to sort of make those relationships and that knowledge and that growth grow. So much going on, I think, there in terms of the power of that as we begin to look at sort of even across different countries in Latin America and all the different Americas, if you will, but looking at the way in which something like BLM, Black Lives Matter, began to resonate because it absolutely touched on something that folks are familiar with, whether we're talking about Black Afro descendants in particular pockets of the world, other pockets of the world, or looking at other kinds of indigenous identities where that call for needs of representation have been made for decades in terms of rights and policy making.
I think for me, when I hear this question and the build up, the local, national and global, you could bring it for the context here at CSU, the impact by our visual arts building, the Black Lives Matter painting that's there. In DC, the protests that happened, changing of a street address in the middle of DC. And then when I see it global, you had particularly, I think it was after George Floyd, sculptures being taken down that were figures who were oppressors, particularly of people from Congolese, from Africa, who were murdered. I mean, you're talking about white folks who were protesting, just a huge movement. And it was like the catalyst that just worldwide who wanted change. And in the middle of a pandemic, and talk about a historical virus, racism. I'm going to go back. We have a lot of questions, and thank you, audience members, for being patient. Given the emphasis on motivation and self-reflection, how can we better motivate people who do not use diversity as part of their work or responsibility? I'm especially wondering about this with intent to make progress towards campuses becoming more than welcoming to international students and underrepresented populations.
I was being patient and trying to process the question as well. There's a lot of pieces to that question. But as I think about sort of the growth, the thing that I picked up on was like the opportunity for growth and how might that happen, right? What are the kinds of things that need to be done to be and present at at the organizational level a welcoming engagement for international students, if we will, in this case, to actually be able to engage. And I think about this, and we were just talking about this in class the other day with the contact hypothesis and some of the questions that are around it. In a nutshell, we're talking about sometimes, you think about like bring diverse people together and let them learn from each other, but it's typically not that easy, right? There are typically a lot of variables that need to be accounted for of building individuation of people within the interactions that might happen on the campus, for example, so that people have the ability to be seen as an individual, as well as being part of a particular a self-identified group that they also avow to. It has to do with trying to find common ground and or foundations of similarity, if you will, common denominators where people might have equal playing fields on not all variables, but on some of these variables, so that we have a sense of ability and a way to perceive each other. In some cases, it might be that we've all decided to come together on a university campus, right? That might be a foundation strength that we can pull from in terms of building that sense of unity, while at the same time trying to discover and learn through the differences that are there. But I get a lot of international students who come to my office and chat with me about like friendship making. And this is a real question, right? How do I come and study at a place? And this is a question that, of course, comes from first generation students and from minoritized individuals as well, similar kinds of things. How do I come to a place and begin to engage and enact the kinds of practices that will help me build friendships here? Because friendships here seem different than the way that I was socialized into friendships in another cultural context, right? And of course, that really speaks to my heart because I'm an interpersonal scholar as well as an intercultural scholar, and I can talk about the importance of friendship making for the rest of the session. I won't, but I can talk about the value, importance of friendship and relationship building. And to me, that begins to sort of think about like, what are the kinds of things that we can be actively doing on campus? I know the international programs has been great with me in the past, for example, of me being able to bring, and when it was instituted, tea time, for example, and hors d'oeuvres and a little bit of snack time, if you will, but being able to bring my classes to engage and start to begin to interact through our sense of inquiry, our sense of curiosity, but at the same time in a safe space and a way that we knew, meaning that we knew we could come together in conversation and there would be a little bit of facilitation going on from different leaders. So lots of things that we can be thinking of doing to build these kinds of channels, build open channels for communication to happen, I think.
Right. Let's see here. How do individuals find the line between generally participating in other cultures due to want to learn and overstepping cultural boundaries? Great question.
There's so much more that I want to ask the friend who asked that question. So my mind just sort of left to kind of interpret just a little bit. But I I'll go back to, the leading with positive intent piece, because that really does go quite a long way. Speaking for myself, making an I statement, I have had many folk who come from different communities from my own. I am African American, ask me questions. I don't mind those questions only because I know that the person is leading with positive intent and is asking a question seeking to understand. So I would encourage folk, of course, to be respectful, asking questions by leading with positive intent. And if you are asking for knowledge, also to think about how can this be a reciprocal conversation. And when you ask someone for their time or for information, also think about, whose time are you taking from and whose time are you giving of yourself?
Those are all great considerations, I think, Malika, and I really like that sort of that carefulness there too. There's nothing more off-putting than feeling as though you're being exoticized in some ways because you have some kind of knowledge or some kind of background or some kind of skill. And so the carefulness there is really important to sort of consider in doing that. I also I know that I have a lot of my colleagues across campus who talk about the distinction between intent and impact. And there's that binary again that I want to be careful with though, right? That I agree with you in terms of if we can begin to understand people's intent, it doesn't solve the problems of some of the impact of something that might go wrong or that gets done that we might have to work towards fixing. But knowing that intent is a starting point for knowing about how to be motivated to work with someone and the possibilities of doing so. One of the things I've learned in my time is that I really like to try to keep that cultural conversation going. And you seem to have a lot of that in your own foundation with your positive intention sort of positionality as well too. How do we keep this cultural conversation going? And in order to do that, I think that you do have to, at times, of course, be able to place yourself in that moment of like, what was it like to sort of learn all these different things that need to be learned and the complexity of learning, particularly if you've never had the ability to engage in those complexities or those differences, over the course of your lifetime as well too. But keeping that cultural conversation going, really important for me. But the last part that I'll put on there is keeping that cultural conversation going, or more generally keeping the conversation going from the interpersonal perspective, but never at the expense of my own well-being. That there is going to be a time when I'm going to need to step aside and pull back and say, that discourse is not productive for me to continue to engage because my well-being, my self-esteem, and I even use the word my cultural esteem, takes a hit that I'm no longer willing to take, at least for this moment.
That's good. Here's a question of, given the direct violence that international students of Asian descent are facing in the US, what can CSU leaders do to better address concerns of safety?
Well, I think immediately addressing those concerns from the fact that students or anyone who's putting this on the call right now is already motivation to say that there's a call for our administration to address this in a public way. There are probably things that needed to be done even sooner. I was thinking of, for example, being on a call this past weekend, last couple of weekends actually, moving through Black History Month. It's also a time for me when, for example, we have a day of remembrance. My father, for example, and his family were were incarcerated in Japanese internment camps. And that marker just went by this past couple of weekends in terms of addressing that and so forth. And one of the things that a lot of folks, I was engaged with, for example, in my own personal groups, my brother who works out of the Central Valley for the Japanese American Civil Liberties organization and so forth. But just thinking about learning about different organizations and different support groups in different places can really help us understand where to find the support when safety is the question on the table. It could also give us support from a university perspective of ways of navigating around and through, not around, but through the challenges that come up with the kinds of violences that ensue. And so using some of these other organizations as knowledge builders and practice builders for the ways that we also engage in the sort of in the university setting, I think are ways that are open for learning to be had there. A lot of folks don't know, for example, that you see a particular group oftentimes and you think that group is there only to support this group. I hear this all the time, right? But so many of these groups work across intersectional identities and across other kinds of minoritized identities and have been there historically for reasons of social justice along the way.
Craig, I just want to call out something, and that is call out to active allyship, then also to leadership, and how every single one of us has a responsibility to be mindful of what is happening, what is going on. And even if it's quote unquote, not your own community, quote unquote, that still does not excuse inaction. So that's the kind of the call, the challenge that I want to lift up here.
I appreciate that from both of you, and being cognizant of time here. We're getting close, and our kind of final question here. Here we go. How do we support students with intersecting identities, enhance their experiences as it pertains with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and intercultural awareness? What a way to wrap up.
I think you may have answered part of this question at least, or given a response, Craig, earlier when you talked about the importance of listening. And one of the things that we talked about on the call was sometimes it's real easy to go to either this group or that group and then begin to try to figure out how to problem solve and or address and or acknowledge, right, the different things that are going on there. And then we miss that sort of complex area in between, the spectrum of complexity of intersectional identities. And so building or building channels for communication for individuals who are self-identified within those intersectional identities, and actually listening to what they have to say about how policymaking, for example, is working and are not working because of some other additional intersectional identity that is not being accounted for in the way that something is being handled. Listening for that, I think, takes a lot of time, effort, but I think that there's a lot of value in doing that because then you begin to sort of understand the nuances that go on with those intersectional intersectional identities.
And I'll just say just two quick things. One is, a reminder for all of us that we all carry with us identities that are apparent or visible, and identities that are not apparent or quote, invisible, and that it's wise not to make assumptions about any of those. And I think if anything, the current context of COVID-19, racial injustice has really kind of peeled the onion back or unearthed, so much that is happening in just across the world, across the space. And so just kind of, being mindful about those things, I think is really important, especially as we are looking at our world through an intersectional lens.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank the both of you with your knowledge, your experience, and expertise. And we are going to wrap up.
Wow. I think this panel was really incredible. I was frantically taking notes and just really engaged with what you were saying. So I really appreciate this panel coming together. I think we all had a lot to learn. I wanted to remind everyone that there is an evaluation that we'd ask if you've got a few minutes to fill out after the session to give us some feedback. Additionally, we recorded this session, and so it will be available on the International Programs website, as well as on our YouTube channel in a few days. And then another quick reminder that our keynote session today will be at 2 p.m. And it's one that I wouldn't miss if you've got the time to join us for the former Mexican ambassador to China, Jorge Guajardo. It will be worth your time. And again, thank you everyone for this excellent panel, and we look forward to seeing you and the rest of them.